In this series, we're going to take your piece from this to this, all using skills, tips and tricks brought to you right here. There's no previous learning needed, no fancy plugins or synthesizers, and no musical understanding. The only things you'll need will be your eyes, your ears, a DAW, and a sample instrument. So come on, let's get started. Hi guys, Adam with Audio Imperia here, and welcome to episode 6 of the journey to becoming a composer. In the first 4 episodes of this series, we've covered the core concepts of MIDI composition, looking at DAWs, MIDI data, and sample playback engines, and how we can utilize key switching, expression, dynamics, velocity, and legato to enhance the realism and musicality of our compositions. In episode 5, we changed gears a little and analysed our musical example, looking at how I composed the piece and some of the compositional techniques that I used. As always, if you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to give us a like and leave us a comment, and also subscribe to our channel to make sure you're the first to hear about new content. In this episode, we're going to be taking an even deeper dive into the orchestration, arrangement, and MIDI programming of this musical example. We're going to be taking a closer look at the strings and brass and seeing how I used the concepts we discussed in episodes 1 to 4 to create maximum realism and expression in the music. Let's get right to it and head on over to the DAW. Hey guys, welcome back to the DAW. So in this episode, as we mentioned, we're going to be taking a closer look at the brass and the strings. We're going to be talking a little bit about orchestration, but also much more specifically about MIDI programming and how we can use MIDI programming to enhance the realism and musicality of the music. So let's start with the brass, because I think they're probably the most prominent section of this piece of music. I'll just play the brass in isolation, then we'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so in the intro section of this piece, we have this little motif. We're starting with the motif just on the French horns. And there's a couple of interesting points from a MIDI programming perspective here. The first is to say that we're obviously using nearly at all times the dynamics and the expression just to create these gentle shifts in dynamics and volume throughout the piece. When any player plays, but particularly brass players, there's always going to be slight variations because they use their breath. It's rare that we can just output our breath at the same amount of force constantly for a period of time. We're nearly always sort of varying it slightly when we're playing, and we can try and capture that with some of the dynamics and expression data, particularly at the end of notes as notes are trailing off. It's really nice just to have a really gentle slope away. That's going to create a lot more realism if the note just suddenly ends. So you can see I'm creating these gentle curves at the ends of notes here, and also gentle rides at the beginning of the note. So if I just play this horn in isolation, so you can hear the second statement of the theme is a lot more powerful and there's a lot more dynamic intensity in it, and I'm just using the dynamics curves to achieve those things. So if we watch with the actual dynamics and expression here, you'll really see how much they're moving. Gently maneuvering these values up and down will create more shape to the music than if you just leave them static. Another thing to mention about the horns here is I'm actually layering 2 instruments here. I'm layering the 6 horns patch, which is the ensemble patch, but I'm also layering that with the beautiful solo horn patch as well. Layering is probably one of the most important concepts in virtual instruments and MIDI programming in general. The reason that we layer is that sample libraries are just pre-recorded, so although these days they can sound tremendously realistic and musical, no one instrument can ever capture absolutely the range and breadth of a real instrumentalist playing the line. Sometimes layering can go some way to help capture something that might be missing from just one instrument, and that's what I've done here. So in the beginning, we have quite a slow, ponderous intro, and everything sounds quite subtle. And when I had the 6 horns playing alone, they sounded a little bit too subtle. Having too much dynamic range made them sound too loud and proud and too bold, but having too little just kind of buried them in the mix a bit. So I'll show you what they sound like on their own. Fine, but they're just missing, particularly when you hear them in the context of the mix. So I wanted something that had a little bit more clarity and detail, and sometimes particularly solo instruments can give you some clarity and detail because it's only capturing one player. There's a lot more clarity in the line. So if I just show you what the solo player sounds like on its own. Has a lot more detail and kind of clarity, but on its own it just sounded a little bit fragile in the context of the mix. So again, I'll show you what it sounded like. It sounded fine, but it just sounded a little bit isolated out there. So what I ended up doing was combining both of these, and to my ears this sounds a lot fuller, but also retains some of the clarity and some of the precision of the solo French horn. So often layering is a good solution, whether that's layering, for example, short articulations with long articulations, or sometimes it might literally be layering two different instruments together to create a color or a sense of musicality that you can't quite achieve with just one of them. So sometimes something is not quite sounding the way you want it to, maybe try layering it either with another instrument or a similar instrument or a solo version of that instrument. You'll often be surprised what you can get in terms of extra detail and clarity. So as we mentioned, everything is building in intensity. So we have the horns playing the motif, then at the end of that first statement of the motif we have the trumpets, then at the end of the trumpets we have the trombones playing the motif, and then halfway through that we have the horns coming back in, and everything is kind of stacking on top of each other with increased frequency. That kind of stacking is creating all these dissonances and tensions which all have to get resolved somewhere, and that's what we do in the middle section here. What's actually going on here is really straightforward. In the horns and the trumpets we have a simple melody. And they're being played in octaves. The horns are taking the lower octave because generally they're a lower instrument with a lower musical range, and the trumpets are taking a high melody because they have a higher range. Together, in octaves, both at the full dynamic level, they just sound really huge. I'm just writing the dynamics and the expression a bit here to keep everything moving. Like we said previously, we never want too much static energy. We always want things to be moving slightly. Supporting them are literally just these big block chords on the trombones, tubas, and low brass. So if I just play them. Really basic stuff. I've just done a couple of things to make these sound a little more musical, and I've used MIDI program to help me do that. First of all, as I'm doing with everything, I'm riding the dynamics and the expression a bit, but in particular what I'm doing is bringing them down just at the ends of these chords. The reason I'm doing that is if you think about the way a player will play, as they get to the end of the chord and they prepare to move on to the next one, there will generally be a kind of lessening of the breath in anticipation of what's going to come next. It's good to simulate that because subconsciously we've come to kind of expect that. In real life, things don't just suddenly change from one chord to the next. Musicians can't really do that, particularly musicians that are using their breath. They have to take these little pauses, or they have to take these little moments where they come down in intensity before they come to the next chord. And to help accentuate that even more, I have these tiny gaps between the chords. Again, players in real life can't just snap from one note to the other. They either have to arrive there using a kind of legato, or they have to take a tiny pause before they play the next note. Since this isn't a melodic line, I'm just using the sustain articulations, and I'm just creating these tiny gaps. Finally, you'll see I played these in and I've left some of the imperfections here. Again, to help combat too much roboticness in the music, sometimes it's good to have tiny imperfections. Now, you don't want to go too overboard with the imperfections because orchestras are chock full of fantastic musicians that don't make terrible mistakes or have lazy timing. They're really good at what they do. But no matter how good you are, there will always be some discrepancy and some randomness and some humanness. And sometimes capturing that can really help with making the MIDI sound more realistic. So I've left those in. As you can see, some notes are starting just before the beat, some notes are starting just after. And similarly, some notes are ending at very slightly different times than the others. Again, you want to be subtle with these things. You don't want to go too crazy because otherwise it will just sound weird. But some gentle use of these techniques will just help create some more realism. Now let's look at the last section of this piece of music. So really, there's not too much to report here. Probably the first thing to say is in the low brass, so the trombones, the tuba, and the very low brass here, we just have this final chord that, as you can see, is swelling in dynamic intensity. Really straightforward stuff, just a nice big B flat major. Over the top of that, we have the horns just playing this slightly dissonant line. That little dissonance here, the F sharp or the G flat over the B flat major, is just creating a little bit of tension that's not quite resolved. So we have a nice big major chord seeing us out, but we have a little bit of tension in the French horns, just helping to keep the excitement high. That's also somewhat doubled in the trumpets. And as you can see, everything is just swelling to maximum for the outro. So let's move on to the strings now. Now, the strings are not playing quite as important a role in this piece, but nevertheless, what they're doing is really supporting the other instruments and adding a lot of color, a lot of density, a lot of gravity to the piece. So let's listen to them in isolation. So all very straightforward stuff. In the beginning, we really just have the low and middle strings. So we don't have any cello at the very beginning, but we have a bass, we have the violas, and we have the second violins. The bass is really just providing this very simple long pedal note. It's just a B flat, and it's holding that B flat, and that's providing a kind of, if you think of almost like a house, just a solid foundation, a very stable foundation. It's going nowhere, it's not changing, it's just providing this bed for all the different instruments to play off. You can hear in the violas and the second violins, we just have these very simple notes that are building towards these increasingly complex harmonies. Pretty straightforward stuff, but again, helping to increase the tension as we go through the intro. That's all going to get released in the middle section. Finally, it's probably worth noting in the violas, we're using the tremolo patch here rather than just sustains. Tremolo is when the players play very quickly back and forth with the bow, and it creates this kind of oscillating, tremulating effect. It's a very different texture from a sustain articulation, and it helps add some movement, some momentum, some rhythmic interest to pieces. It's really just helping to add some color to that intro. Finally, the first violins are just taking the melody and playing alongside the trumpets in this piece, just to add some more weight at that point. You'll see, much like the brass, I'm always using the dynamics and the expression. Even if it's only gentle, I never like to keep things too static for too long. And generally speaking, this intro is building in intensity until bar 9, when everything becomes huge. So as you can see, I'm just using the dynamics to help create that intense swell. When we get to bar 9, again, it's much like the brass. It's pretty simple. In the first violins and second violins, we have the melody, and then in the violas, the celli, and the basses, we just have a very simple harmony. Probably only really a couple of things to note here from a MIDI program and an orchestration perspective. First of all, I have the violins playing in octaves here. The reason I've done that is, much like the horns and the trumpets, having things playing in octaves adds a lot more weight and really helps to bring melodies out in the mix. And doubling the violins in octaves is one of the most common orchestral techniques that you'll come across. It just helps create a very full, very rich sound. You get the top end and the sheen and the brilliance from the first violins, but you get a bit more of a foundational element from the second violins, and combined they can just sound huge. And you'll see in particular, if we add these with the trumpets and the horns, the whole effect is just really pretty huge. Having that melody across so many different octaves with so many different colors just really helps it cut through in the music. The lower strings are much like the lower brass, just big held chords. Really not much to talk about there. We're using the dynamics a little bit just to help create some movement. And also you'll notice down the bottom here are my key switches. So I'm using key switches in this piece to move, for example, from the tremolo to the sustained. And finally the outro. Let's have a little listen to this on the strings alone. Not too much to talk about here. One thing you'll notice is that I've used the key switches to change to tremolo at this point. This is again quite a common orchestral technique, sometimes in these big crescendo sections to help the strings cut through and to help continue the momentum and create this sense of intensity. Tremolo can really just add an extra layer. So had these been sustained, they would have sounded fine, but with tremolo it really brings the climax to a kind of thundering conclusion. And there we have it, guys. That's a little look at the brass and the strings in this piece, and particularly how we've used MIDI programming to shape some realism and musicality. One thing I urge you to do, like we have in previous episodes, we provided a link to this MIDI in the description below. Highly recommend you download it, check it out, connect it up to Nucleus and just see how this works. And also don't be afraid to just change things around. Try different articulations, try changing the dynamics in the expression data and see what that does. Maybe you'll find things that you actually prefer or ways to increase the realism and musicality of this piece. Just have fun. I think the best way to learn is just to play around and see why things work. You can always go back to what was, but maybe sometimes you'll unlock some really cool techniques or some really cool ideas, and that's how you learn and grow. So there we go. I hope this episode has been really useful for giving you some idea about how we use the concepts we've discussed in this series in an actual composition. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a closer look at the woodwind and the percussion and seeing how I use the concepts we discussed in episodes 1 to 4 in those sections. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.